Project Looking Glass and many other systems of military intelligence allows the capacity of the Confederates to run the black market by projection, layering it exponentially on itself, allowing themselves to ignore large portions of their due diligences, which facilitates their ability to engage in gross negligence while they know not to look into it, lest it be investigated and be found out to be the materially true answer, at which point they collectively conduct the system and leave with the strategic aspect of it and then layer on that strategy as the bigotry and then their political or other biases are influenced in the new series of the investigations as those stack exponentially into the function of Plato's conspiracy, which is how they manage or enforce their rape culture, which is the predetermined sexual options for each of the parties, including the use of sabotage of targets who would have challenged it or are high likelihood of challenging um, the outcome that they want, at which point that can be conducted in all of the various competitions, not just the sexual market. At this point, you systematically have that arrangement which facilitates their ability to engage in the Confederate arranged rapes, which would not be prosecuted by Confederates and would actively be undermined under the secret arrangements of Confederate KKK magic in order to defend the rape in question, such as the high level politicians who are able to rape people and then no one defends them, and then they're discarded or punished, etc. These types of arrangements are normalized in that system, which facilitates their ability to engage in the highest investment powers to validate the lowest activities for that black market. And this being the system has led to their highest likelihood opponents, which is the foundation of the War on David. Their projections before birth of their highest threats, once they materialize who the threats would be, they would then materially conduct the abuses and sabotage it as an illusion so people don't see how the thing was forfeited, how the contest was sabotaged and thus the forfeit, and thus they only see the results, and thus they want to validate that contest despite the fact it was forfeited in favor of the other party, at which point the situation would be awkward to engage in stating to those participants uh, that the party won actually out of the expiration date of its emotional validation, at which point it's just a series of forfeited or sabotaged or collapsed or illegitimate contests, which is not transferred into the social courts um, mentality on how to validate the winner or the loser, at which point it facilitates the transfer into the legal court at the exponential period of time concerning the due diligence of the damages concerning all of their offenses, and that then becomes the new subjects. And these engagements facilitate their mechanism of plausible deniability as they actively avoid the research that they've done in order to found all of the strategies. At which point, if you engage in the phantom cell structures, such as their creation of the terrorists in the Middle East, which they never gave control up for, they only have mechanisms of delayed responses, so they only have important messages that they could send, and thus the default end of the message to implement a particular strategy would then uh, have to be forfeited in favor of its stability. Their ability to generically control it at a distance allows them to plan 30 or 50 years in advanced for all of these things, which is how they did Project Northwoods in 9/11. Their control over the terrorists inside the Middle East and protect their ability to get in and conduct the mission all was a part of these types of strategies, and their ability to have classified it away from the structure of the United States government to be able to stop the insurrectionist crime, uh, like when they tried to do the Northwoods with JFK and he told them no, and then they assassinated him. They removed those probable threats from stopping them, at which point they're actively coercing as a second government through the espionage war of the Confederates through KKK unprofessional militia, which engages in these terrorist operations. And the old statement of Khrushchev or some other party from Russia stated that they could destroy the United States without firing a single shot by infecting the United States with the death plan. They chose those compromised positions, which the United States would be too unprofessional to follow their own rules in order to stop the threat, allows for the collapse of the system. And the West, having generically been infected by this, refuses to make the correction. And at that point, all Putin has to do in order for it to succeed is to be professional and correct and the rest of it. At which point, the function of him being put into these no-win situations is contested over the position of the war on David. Now, the insurance David would have provided to the former Soviet Union, according to those projections, would have made NATO incapable of the desired outcome in their Cold War apparatus. And the West, having received the same thing on the other side, means they both, having agreed to not publicly acknowledge the estimate about David, facilitates their collapse on their particular interest. And it doesn't really matter on the east side what the damages are. The complete west is completely destroyed, and the disillusionment of the West power is founded on David not being restored, which means his insurance structure for curing all of the infection aspects, which they are defending, um, would naturally be removed. And thus, the insurgents' entire national loyalties are threatened by virtue of the existence of the United States doing a survivable strategy. If the West conducts itself in a way under David's control in order to survive against that infection, from the white supremacy confederacy, which is engaged in the factions of using all of those phantom cells from the military intelligence against American hegemony and Western interests, facilitates the natural outcome predetermined from those strategies as they simply just let the entire thing collapse. And they would rather uh, the West be destroyed than return what is owed to David under the direct knowledge that their loyalties as a confederacy um, is completely eradicated. David's control is the death of the double agents. The Confederate white supremacist, systematic racism, and other criminal organizations who have bedded themselves as their own denominations of the KKK in the Western governments would completely be eradicated from all power. So their nation, as a terrorist organization, as a mafia, as a confederacy, is completely destroyed by that action. So the East could win in their mind, or they can lose. At which point, uh, they're basically both agreeing in that negotiation from the Cold War point of view. And these are all 1950s, 1960s type decisions, which they're just leaving alone, for the overarching damages, such as the nuclear waste, which was complained about by Josh Hawley, which could not be solved by virtue of these pre-planned Confederate military operations from their investigations through the military equipment for the intelligence apparatus to lay out the future history of the unfree society in the management of the unfree market for the white supremacist communism to be enforced, which by definition means that status and wealth uh, is racist. So if they, having conducted the racist engagement of using Project Looking Glass in order to maximize the wealth of their interest, and 1930s United States was deeply racist. So their negotiations for that type of strategy, which they have actively been denying access or having had, would have been founded on the racism. And that racism, engaging in that communism, is actively applied today, but with all of the layers, purifying the thing to make it look better than it is, at which point the obstruction of contracts and associations and other fundamental rights, which have been undermined by the intelligence community's terrorist organizations engaging in their KKK denominations, enforcement of its phantom cell objectives, engages in illegitimate outcomes, which the law has to correct against, which the Supreme Court, loyal to the white supremacy, says that there cannot be a remedy to a secret, which is the validation of the crime. The only reason not to remedy a thing is aiding and abetting the offense as bad faith and disloyalty to office. And the refusal to allow that correction is the refusal to a remedy, is a refusal to repentance against an injury to the national interests, is the validation of the disease, is the validation of its side effects, is the validation of its inevitable collapse from the death sentence arranged in the infection, which can only be cured by systematically engaging in the recovery systems, which requires them to acknowledge that there's a problem and to engage in the medical or other corrections, allowing for the cure to happen, purifying the system from the death sentence. At which point, if you're going to have cancer, you need to have the cures to cancer. And this white supremacy is national cancer to the West. In the 90s, these phantom cell operations, such as with Scott Ritter's orders in the federal government to engage in the Middle Eastern attacks, stating that if a investigation is legitimate, and we all agree that it's legitimate, that they get to leave the hierarchy concerning whether or not to engage in a military operation, to act independently of the hierarchy, to do so with full force backing it up, as the Phantom Cell arrangement is not loyal to the American Free Society system, and thus is not an operation of the republics, and thus is an operation of the Confederacy. And thus the attack by those arrangements, independent of any legal authority or government, has the full backing of stealing the equipment of that legal government, such as, but it's not limited to, the secret records arrangement of them doing that against Israel, which triggers their war on terror policy against all Jews around the world to finish the final solution from the Nazis, who have, by definition, actively been ingested into the United States and have been protected by the intelligence community, and the arrangement of their access to the intelligence community's equipment under the strategies that they've been implementing allows them to engage in that mechanism of trading on the Confederate black market to validate the Nazis' bigotries and have it cleaned and purified for the natural outcome desired by those behind the Holocaust. Thus, those who validate all of the injuries protecting that system are validating the Holocaust ex post facto, which certifies it as a de facto policy, which is the mechanism of the Second Holocaust, which validates those particular damages as their foundational bias put into the Looking Glass program, which allows them to specifically strategize and perfectly align all of their specific outcomes in favor of it so that it can have the finalized orders on how it is to be enforced covertly and publicly, which generates the natural outcome by the white supremacist communism and fascism. Many distraction arguments exist, including the function of insider trading in order to undermine the wizard communism, which is fundamentally fraudulent because in order to defeat the communists who are insider trading under those mechanisms, you would by definition be countering the insider trading, and thus the trades are blind in reality, but it is objectively countering and extorting for the major injury of those who are insider trading, undermining their returns under that projection. Thus, the real thing that they're worried about is the injury to their criminal returns, which they did not have a right to and legally would be forced to forfeit under the American system if the United States did its job. It would restore David under these estimates, which would remove all of their wealth and their access to any property that they would have generated in relation to their crimes. Thus, uh, we are led by Confederate felons, and being led by criminals, it is against the law to do law enforcement, which is by definition the infection, which is a death sentence to the nation, which is an act of treason. So, whether or not you look at the situation by any angle, it'll always end up in insurrection and high treason to side against David Bowles in any of his claims, as the slightest opposition to delay him or interfere with any of the subjects would lead to catastrophic injuries to American hegemony around the world. Now, the intricacies of all of the Confederate factions seeking the dismantlement and collapse of the West engages in these terrorist operations against David and the undermining of his interest to dismantle national security of the United States by systematic sedition. And the only way to have solved the Cold War was David as the peace child, which resolves the conflicts, solving all of the actual legitimate exchanges with all of the threatened combatants and potential combatants to engage in the resolution of the solutions under David's kingdom as a brokerage from lowest to highest, from brokering associations to brokering national treaties and power brokerings of all kinds and exchanges. And this settlement of refined, perfected, exact, precise decisions allows for the resolved order to engage in the various forms of federal law enforcement for most of those trades, solving the threats that escalate into the wars, such as the war in Ukraine, which is a proxy war between Russia and the Confederacy, which seeks to extort all of the advantages founded on the Confederates' choice for David to marry, losing to somebody else who they believed would have been based in Ukraine, seeking the devastation of Ukraine as a retaliation, and then finding other justifications to back this in the various forms of the bias-led Looking Glass and other military intelligence equipment allows them to stack this to maximize their particular goals, minimizing the function of it coming back to its actual core motive, which facilitates their ability to have simulated reality in this non-legal version that we are currently suffering in the worst timeline by the children of perdition. The primary value is for the cultists, such as the Satanists, making those exchanges on the crime market, establishing status on the basis of being able to make the most injuries to the most things, at which point their targeting of David affects the most things, removes the most security, creates the most injuries, signifies the higher importance, signifies the higher sacrifice, signifies the higher value to their debt-based society. Their ability to engage in debts to society certifies their primary currency as the Confederacy, and these attacks against the United States ramp up the core incentive and motive and identity of their collective society as an anti-American arrangement. And the anti-Americans, seeing that the threat of the Russians could collapse the United States, is irrelevant because they seek to take over the United States once America has actually collapsed. And thus their advantage is in the destruction of the country and its interests in favor of their own powers in the insurrection as they divide the country up between the coalition factions, including the other adversaries who helped with the strategy to destroy the United States in the West, dividing it up amongst the larger parties around the world, such as the Chinese, who would take large portions of the former United States in the invasions with the final crushing of the American systems as it settles on the white supremacist communist arrangements. So if you ask a question from the record, such as who do you prefer, the Confederates or the Chinese, to own American territories, it's an irrelevant question as they are both anti-American bad choices for the American public, and the answer is irrelevant as they've already settled on the Chinese to own it or other.